Good morning. My sister-in-law's birthday is coming up the first part of June, and I decided to give her the present of a story from yesteryear. This story takes place, I think, probably Depression era, and it's called Soup, a collection of stories by Robert Newton Peck. And the story I selected for today is called Apples and Mrs. Stetson. Soup was my best pal. His real and righteous name was Luther Wesley Vinson, but nobody called him Luther. He didn't like it. I called him Luther just once, which prompted Soup to break me of a very bad habit before it really got formed. As soon as the swelling went out of my lip, I called him Soup instead of Soup. He first discouraged his mother of the practice, calling him Luther, using a different method, of course. She used to call him home to mealtime by yelling, "Luther!" But he never answered to the name. He'd rather miss supper. When his mother got wise, she'd stand out on the back porch, cup her hands in her mouth, and yell, "Soup, son!" From a distance. Their farm was up road next to ours. All you could hear was Soup. And that was how the kids who were playing ball in the pasture started thinking his name was Soup, because he answered to it. When it came to getting the two of us in trouble, Soup was a regular genius. He liked to whip apples. But that was nothing new. Every kid did. The apple had to be small and green and hard, about the size of a golf ball. The whip had to be about 4 to 5 feet long, with the point on the small end that you'd whittle sharp with your jackknife. You held the apple close to your chest with your left hand and pushed the pointed stick into the apple, but not so far as to come out yonder side. No matter how careful you speared the apple, a few drops of juice would squirt on your shirt. They dried to small brown spots that never even came out in the wash. Sassafras made the best whips. You could swing a sassafras whip through the air so fast it would whistle. The apple would fly off, and you'd think it would never come down. To whip an apple was sport enough for most of us, but not for old Soup. "Watch this," he said. "What?" I said. We were up on the apple orchard on the hillside that overlooked town. Below us was the Baptist church. "I bet I can hit the Baptist church." "You better not, Soup." "Why not?" "Well, we'll really catch it." "No, we won't. And what's more, I bet this apple can hit the bell in the bell tower and make it ring." Won't go that far." "Oh, no?" Soup whipped his apple, and I was right. It landed far short of the Baptist church. "Watch me," I said, and with my next throw, I almost hit the church roof. "My turn," said Soup. I'll have to admit that Soup put all he had into the next throw. The whip made a whistle that would have called a dead dog. The old apple took off like it'd been shot out of a gun, made a big arc through the sky, and for a few long seconds, I thought we'd hear that bell ring for sure. But we never heard the sounding brass. What we heard was the tinkling cymbal of broken window. Breaking a plain pane of old glass wasn't stylish enough for Soup. It had to be stained glass. Even the sound of that stained glass shattering had color in it. I just stood there looking at that tiny black star of emptiness that was once a window pane. It was like somebody busted my heart. "No," I said in almost a whisper. I wanted the glass to fly back into place again, like it had never happened, so that little black star would erase away like a bad dream. But there it was, and there it stayed. "No," said Soup. My feet were stuck to the ground like I was standing in twin buckets of mortar. I couldn't run, not even when a lady ran out the side door of the church and pointed up at us. Even though she was far below, it felt like her finger took a stab right into my chest. It was a pain, just like when you get stuck with the tip of a sword. And to make matters worse, it was Mrs. Stetson. My family wasn't Baptist, but I guess that she knew Mama and Aunt Carrie real well because she came to call almost every week. Religion was her favorite subject. You'd be hard put to find a soul who knew more about God than Mrs. Stetson. She was a walking, talking Bible, which she could quote chapter and verse. Get her started, and it went on like rain, 40 days and 40 nights. Just to be in the same room with Mrs. Stetson was like being caught in a downpour, and she sure could drench a body with scripture. But what she was saying now was far from holy. And if there is anything Mrs. Stetson was poor at, it was talking as she climbed full speed up a steep hill. By the time she reached me, she was so out of breath from the uphill scolding that she couldn't say a word. I looked around for Soup, but he was gone. Good old Soup. So there I stood with a sassafras stick in my hand and apple juice spots on the front of my shirt, still wet. The mortar in my shoes had now hardened to stone. My ears were ringing with the tinkle, tinkle, tinkle of smashing glass that wouldn't seem to stop. "You," she said. "Me?" Her eyes burned with the wrath of the Old Testament. It was plain to behold that Mrs. Stetson believed that you had to smite transgressors so that the ground ran red with their blood until the multitudes were sore afraid, especially sore. But if anybody ever looked sore, it was Mrs. Stetson. "Robert Peck," she said in full voice, and her big hand shot out and grabbed my face and my hair. She shook me hard enough to shake off one of my shoes. Then after she stopped shaking me, she twisted my head around so my nose was pointing right at the little black star of the broken window pane. "Just look what you did," said Mrs. Stetson. "Look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Do you dare say you didn't?" "I didn't." This was not the response that she expected. I guess what she really sought was an outburst of guilt, a tear-soaked plea to ask for the forgiveness of God and Mrs. Stetson, and perhaps not in that order of importance. "I didn't. Honest, Mrs. Stetson, I didn't throw an apple that far. Look how far it is." "You did do it. I saw you do it, and here's the apple you did it with." She had a pierced apple in one hand and my switch in the other, and I knew I was a goner. "But I couldn't hit the church from way up here. Nobody could." "Bosh! Even a fool knows how far an apple will pitch from a stick. Watch." You won't believe what I saw. Mrs. Stetson somehow let go of her senses. She pushed an apple on the stick, and before I could grab her arm, her temper bested reason. Whoosh! You never saw a worse throw in your life. Not if you stood up in that old orchard from now till judgment. Her apple never even headed in the direction of the Baptist church, nowhere near. But you couldn't say that apple didn't have any steam to it. No, sir, it took off her stick, my stick, like a rifle ball, going east by northeast, and finally tipped over a flower pot with a geranium in it outside old Haskin shack window, and the pot cracked the glass. Crash tinkle! Out came old Mr. Haskin with blood in his eye. His language would have made Satan himself cover his ears. Not real fancy swearing, just a long string of old favorites. He pointed at Mrs. Stetson and me, and then started uphill and coming our way fast. "Run!" yelled Mrs. Stetson. "That man's a degenerate." We ran, Mrs. Stetson and I. She had on 2 shoes, and I wore one, which evened the speed up a bit, and we ran as if hell was a step behind. We ran until we could no longer hear the terrible things that old Haskin shouted he would do to Mrs. Stetson the next time she came near his rotten old shack. We didn't stop running, Mrs. Stetson and I, till we darted into Frank Rooker's garage and had the bolted the door. But as we ran in, Soup ran out after taking one look at Mrs. Stetson. Out the side door he shot into the arms of Mr. Haskin. Soup still had his switch in his hand, and his shirt front was smelled and spotted with apple juice, which was enough evidence for old Haskin. Borrowing the sassafras switch, the old man gave Soup a fine smarting. I'll have to admit it sure must have been a sight to see, but from where Mrs. Stetson and I stood panting, we didn't see it, but we heard it all. Thinking I'd be next, I even winced for poor Soup with every blow. Best of all, we heard him confess up to breaking the window, even though it wasn't the same glass he got thrashed for. In a way, it really was justice. Mrs. Stetson was right. There really is a God. And just to let you know, the tribute to this book is to the Reverend Luther Wesley Vinson, a shepherd of his flock, from his first sheep. So, just a fun book. Thank you, and happy birthday to a lady that's been my good friend.